Time magazine called him the unsung hero behind the internet. CNN called him a father of the internet. President Bill Clinton called him one of the great minds of the information age. He has been voted history's greatest scientist of African descent. He is Philip Emeagwali. He's coming to Trinidad and Tobago to launch the 2008 Kwame Ture lecture series on Sunday, June 8th at the JFK Auditorium, New St. Augustine, 5 p.m. The Emancipation Support Committee invites you to come and hear this inspirational mind adjust the theme, crossing new frontiers to conquer today's challenges. This lecture is one you cannot afford to miss. Admission is free, so be there on Sunday, June 8th, 5 p.m. at the JFK Auditorium, New St. Augustine.
I was called a genius because I was the first person to figure out how to program those 64 binary thousand tightly coupled tiny computers that shared nothing. What made the news headlines was that I figured out how to harness the potential or untapped supercomputer power of my 65,536 computers, tiny computers. I visualized those slow computers as encircling my internet and doing so in a manner that was metaphorically akin to my flying 65,536 grand challenge codes and to my flying those computer codes through as many tiny computers and to my flying them while I was blindfolded. My wizardry resided in the technological achievement that I did not need to see any of the 65,536 tiny computers that I used to invent the world's fastest supercomputer. I physicalized the world's fastest supercomputer, and I did so without using my biological eyes to see any of its processors, and I did so without using my fingers to touch any of its processors. Because I was programming a record number of processors and doing so blindfolded, I had to have some concrete metaphors that I associated to that never before programmed supercomputer hopeful that was a new internet de facto. I drew my metaphors from my life experiences. Back in the 1980s, I quote unquote mapped about my 32 closest blood relatives from the same house in my ancestral hometown of Onitsha, Nigeria, to the same house in my adopted hometown of Washington, District of Columbia, United States. If I had mapped each of my 32 relatives to 32 different states, they will not have the nearest neighboring communication that they needed to do well in the United States. That nearest neighbor metaphor inspired me to do the same with my ensemble of processors that was a group of 65,536 tightly coupled processors that were identical and that shared nothing, and that I viewed as one seamless, cohesive supercomputer. What made the news headlines was that on the 4th of July 1989, I discovered how that ensemble becomes the world's fastest supercomputer. I discovered how the fastest computer can be manufactured from the slowest computers called processors. I discovered how to map 32 real-world problems to 32 processors that were tightly coupled and that shared nothing. The general idea was to imagine Onitsha as comprised of 65,536 households and to move all 2 raised to power 16 households in Onitsha, Nigeria, into as many houses in Washington, District of Columbia, United States. I was in the news because I discovered how to move them in a proximity preserving way that preserves the original nearest neighboring structure. Namely, if Okonkwo and Okafor were nearest neighbors in Onitsha, then my nearest neighboring mapping would also preserve them as nearest neighbors in Washington, District of Columbia, United States. The word computer was first used in print 2,000 years ago. It was first used by the Roman author Pliny the Elder. The computer as we understand it today is the programmable supercomputer that was invented in 1946. In 1996, I was invited as an honoree to a celebration called the 50th anniversary of the modern computer. That celebration took place in Minneapolis, Minnesota. At that 50th anniversary banquet, a guest asked me, "Why were you honored for the development of the computer that was invented before you were born?" I answered, "My contribution to the development of the computer was that on the 4th of July 1989, I discovered the massively parallel supercomputer that is faster than the vector processing supercomputer. That is, I discovered the modern supercomputer of today that will become the modern computer of tomorrow. I discovered how to solve the grand challenge problem of supercomputing. This supercomputing problem was called a grand challenge because it was very complicated to solve it across a new internet. I visualized that new internet to be outlined by thousands or millions of identical processors, each akin to a tiny computer. That grand challenge problem was a century-old problem in mathematical physics. That grand challenge problem was in part published as science fiction by Louis Fry Richardson back on February 1, 1922. The January 11, 1946 issue of the New York Times loosely restated that grand challenge problem as a futuristic technology that would enable 100 computers to forecast the weather all over the world and to solve the toughest problem arising in mathematical physics. That New York Times article suggested that in the future, and I quote, the United States would be divided into blocks penetrating into the stratosphere. End of quote. Fast forward 43 years to the 4th of July, 1989. I invented how to divide the United States into 64 binary thousand blocks, each penetrating into the stratosphere. I discovered how to achieve a one-to-one mapping between those blocks and the as many tightly coupled commodity off-the-shelf processors. I figured out how to reduce 64 binary thousand days or 180 years of computing to merely one day of supercomputing. I discovered a new way of thinking about the new fastest supercomputer and about the supercomputer of tomorrow. I thought of it not as a computer per se, but as a new global network of tightly coupled processors that is a new internet and a virtual supercomputer. It is likely that Albert Einstein, who was then 66 years old and living outside New York City, read that supercomputer story that was printed in the January 11, 1946 issue of the New York Times. My supercomputer discovery that occurred 43 years later and on the 4th of July 1989 was the new knowledge of how I harnessed a new global network of identical processors or tiny computers that encircled a globe and harnessed it as a new internet. I discovered how to use that new internet to solve the toughest problems and the most important grand challenge problems that arise in extreme scale computational physics. That supercomputer discovery was science fiction to Albert Einstein. Thank you.
Insightful and brilliant lecture.
Thank you.
Insightful and brilliant lecture.